Today, vandals disrupt trains in France hours before the Olympic opening ceremony. 2 top leaders of the Sinaloa drug cartel are arrested in Texas. Venezuelans head to the polls this weekend. And Ukraine shifting emphasis on the diplomatic front. It's Friday, July 26th. This is Reuters World News, bringing you everything you need to know from the front lines in 10 minutes every weekday. I'm Tara Oakes in Liverpool. Vandals have targeted the Paris Olympics with a series of coordinated attacks on France's train network, causing travel chaos ahead of the opening ceremony. The state-owned railway operator said arsonists had targeted installations along the lines connecting Paris with cities across France. There was no immediate claim of responsibility and no indication of whether the action was politically related. Rachel Armstrong is our Europe editor. So Rachel, what do we know so far?
France woke up this morning to chaos on its railway lines. The high-speed lines coming into Paris from the Atlantic coast, from the north, from the east, were all crippled after train operator said there had been vandalism on the lines. We understand that this involves signal boxes were set alight overnight, bringing chaos to the lines, which is set to last all the weekend. Just the news that Paris didn't want this morning.
Yeah, and France have made such a point that security has been really tight for the games. How could this have happened?
There is an iron curtain around central Paris. You cannot move for seeing groups of police on every street corner and on patrols. The questions that are likely to be asked are that, did France leave the rest of the country vulnerable to this kind of action? There are 45,000 police officers on duty in France, many drafted in from other parts of the country. So that is a huge number of police officers who have been drafted in from other parts of the country. And now there will be questions about whether that left the transport network vulnerable to this type of attack.
Mexican drug kingpin Ismael El Mayo Zambada and the son of crime boss Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, have been arrested in El Paso, Texas. Zambada is one of the biggest traffickers in Mexico's history and co-founded the Sinaloa cartel with El Chapo, who is serving a life sentence in the US. Both Zambada and El Chapo's son, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, face multiple charges for funneling huge quantities of drugs to the US, including fentanyl.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
US Vice President Kamala Harris pushing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to reach a Gaza ceasefire deal. The likely Democratic presidential nominee struck a tougher tone than President Joe Biden after holding face-to-face talks with the Israeli leader. Netanyahu is set to meet with former President Donald Trump in Florida later today.
We call to say Michelle and I couldn't be prouder to endorse you and to do everything we can to get you through this election and into the Oval Office.
The call Kamala Harris has been waiting for. Former President Barack Obama and his wife Michelle endorsing her bid for president. The endorsement was announced in a video capturing a phone call between the trio.
And to those in Alberta and around the world who have experienced the magic of Jasper, the magic is not lost and it never will be.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith choking back tears after a raging wildfire devastated the Western Canadian tourist town of Jasper. Up to half the town's buildings have potentially been destroyed and thousands of people evacuated. Equity markets are in a calmer spot after the wild ride earlier in the week. Kamal Crimmins has more.
That tech-led stock rout has indeed taken a pause while traders wait for key US inflation data. US and European stock futures are both pointing up right now. And sticking with the US, If you're interested in what will happen to President Biden's economic legacy now that he's out of the presidential race, do check out this week's episode of my podcast, Reuters Econ World. It's all about Bidenomics. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Sunday's presidential election in Venezuela has attracted a level of voter enthusiasm not seen in years. President Nicolas Maduro says he'll win a third term in a landslide, despite presiding over an extended economic collapse. And while there is evidence of strong support for the opposition, there are also concerns about the fairness of the vote. Julia Sims-Cobb is in Caracas.
What we've heard from voters is that Venezuela's long economic crisis is really starting to have a profound effect on how they are deciding to vote in this election. The country has suffered hyperinflation, it suffered shortages. A third of the population has migrated out of the country over the last 10 years or so. And people have learned to survive those hardships, but it is getting to a point where many people are deeply frustrated. Shortages are not as bad now, but prices for basic goods still are high relative to what most people are earning. And many people are suffering lack of public services. And that's really taking a toll on people and urging a lot of energy for change.
What are the concerns about the legitimacy of the vote?
The opposition and some observers have questioned whether the vote will be fair. Some of the factors include arrests of opposition supporters and staff members. The head of security for opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who was going to be the candidate until a ban on her holding public office was upheld in January. Her security chief was arrested last week. He was released a day later. And 6 members of her team have taken refuge in the Argentinian embassy in Caracas after warrants were issued for their arrests.
And yet there's a huge enthusiasm on the ground, especially for Maduro's challenger, Edmundo Gonzalez.
This is the highest level of enthusiasm that we've seen for an opposition candidate in a decade. And that's partly because the opposition boycotted the 2018 presidential election. So this vote now is the first time, really since 2013, that we've seen opposition supporters out on the streets following a candidate. But there is still a lot of inequality in terms of press coverage and publicity around the candidates. State media is very dominant in Venezuela, and they cover almost exclusively Maduro and his allies.
Ukraine has said it's open to talks on the war with Russia, provided its sovereignty and territorial integrity are fully respected. That was the message from Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba after a day of talks in China, which positions itself as neutral on the war. The Kremlin has also signalled that it's open to negotiations with Ukraine on ending the conflict even while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky remains in power, despite publicly doubting his legitimacy to rule. Mike Collett-White is Reuters editor-at-large for the war in Ukraine. Mike, how can we characterise these developments?
I think what we're seeing is a shift in emphasis as opposed to a big change in positions or a, let's say, softening on Ukraine's side. Our feeling from talking to people in Zelensky's circle is that this is part of a way for Ukraine to reach out to what we call the global south, which is countries in Africa, South America, China, who have been less than warm towards Ukraine's peace proposals, who have been neutral or even perhaps siding with Russia in the war. And they want to win these people over. They want to convince these countries that they are not hardline, that they're not just pro-Americans, that they're listening to other people's positions.
How likely is it that we could see Kyiv and Moscow sitting down for peace talks this year?
It's a good question, and it's really tough to answer. They are so far apart that I think we have to be realistic here. And yes, this change in emphasis is really interesting and worth following, but there are many, many reasons why they would not sit down to a table to talk peace at this stage, not least of which Ukraine is in a very weak position in the battlefield. It's losing territory to the Russians. So in a way, why would they talk now? The Russians have said consistently, we're ready for peace talks, but let's not forget who started this war. And let's not forget that their conditions are anathema to Kiev.
We usually give you a recommended read at the end of the pod, but today we'll push our own wares a bit and give you a recommended listen. Tomorrow's special edition of Reuters World News on fentanyl. It accompanies a special report where our colleagues found they could purchase everything needed to make $3 million worth of fentanyl for just $3,600. There's a link to that report in the pod description, and our special episode will be published on Saturday. And for more on any of the stories from today, check out Reuters.com or the Reuters app. We'll be back on Monday with our daily headline show. And to never miss an episode, subscribe on your favourite podcast player.